The girl had been born into a family that measured worth in coin and cattle, not in compassion. She was the third daughter, plain-faced, quiet, and too frail for the heavy work her parents demanded. Her sisters had married well enough, taken by men who sought beauty or dowries, but she was left behind, considered useless. When the family's debts pressed too hard, they saw her not as blood but as a burden they could barter away. One cold morning, without so much as a blessing, her father told her to gather her things. She had no things, just a thin dress and the shoes that pinched her feet. A man from the mountains had come down to the village. He was rough-looking, broad-shouldered, his beard unkempt and his eyes the color of storm clouds. He had no family, no land worth boasting of, just a cabin half broken in the woods. He offered a handful of coins and some hides, and in the eyes of her parents, that was enough. She didn't cry when they gave her away. She had learned long ago that tears earned nothing but more cruelty. The man said little as he took her hand and led her away, his grip firm, not unkind but not tender either. The village children whispered and laughed, saying she was being carried off by a beast. She lowered her eyes and walked, her heart heavy but strangely calm. The trail to the mountains was long, winding through forests that grew darker the higher they climbed. He led her to a cabin built of logs, standing strong though weather-beaten. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the smell of pine and earth surrounded it. It was not much, but it was more than she had ever owned. He set down his pack and spoke at last. "This place is mine. Now it's yours too." His voice was deep, almost gruff, but it carried no malice. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. The days that followed were quiet, filled with tasks she had never been trusted with before. He showed her how to gather kindling, how to patch the roof with moss, how to snare rabbits along the ridges. At first, she stumbled, clumsy and unsure, expecting him to scold her as her family had. But he never raised his voice. When she failed, he only showed her again, patient in his own stern way. At night, when the wind howled against the cabin walls, she would sit by the fire and watch him work, mending tools, carving wood, sharpening his knife. He was not handsome in the way her sisters' husbands were, but there was something steady about him, something that made her feel, for the first time, that she was not in danger of being cast aside. Weeks turned into months. Her hands grew calloused, her steps sure. She learned the songs of the forest, the creak of the pines in winter, the rush of the streams in spring. The cabin no longer felt like a prison but a shelter, a place where she belonged. One evening, after she had cooked a meal of venison stew, he sat across from her and spoke words that startled her. "I took you because I thought I needed someone to keep this cabin alive. But you've given it more than life. You've given it warmth." He paused, meeting her eyes for the first time in a way that wasn't just practical or distant. "I don't see you as they did. You're not useless. You're my wife." The word struck her chest like a blow, not in pain but in wonder. No one had ever claimed her, not with dignity, not with affection. Her family had traded her away, but this man, this mountain soul, had built her a place and given her a name she had never thought to carry with pride. She lowered her gaze, tears finally spilling, the kind she had never allowed herself to shed in her parents' house. But when his rough hand reached across the table to cover hers, she did not pull away. For the first time, she felt the ache inside her heart begin to heal. The snow came early that first year, thick and unyielding, covering the mountain in a blanket that silenced all but the crack of trees splitting under the weight of ice. She had never seen so much white, endless and merciless. At first, she was afraid that the cold would swallow her whole, that the cabin's logs would splinter and leave them exposed. But he had prepared, stacks of wood lined against the wall, a store of smoked venison and jars of berries preserved in honey, furs thick enough to wrap around them both. He worked harder than she thought any man could, his body rising before dawn, his boots crunching out into the snow to check traps, his arms carrying back game through drifts that reached his knees. She waited for him each day, tending the fire, mending the clothes, learning to bake bread in the iron pot he had brought with him years ago. She had never been trusted with such tasks in her father's house. There, she had been pushed aside, told her hands spoiled things, told she was clumsy. But here, each mistake was a lesson. Burnt bread was not shame, only knowledge for tomorrow. A poorly stitched seam was not grounds for punishment, but another chance to try again. One night when the wind howled so fiercely that the shutters rattled and the fire guttered, she woke to find him placing another blanket over her shoulders. He thought she was asleep, and his rough hand lingered at her cheek for a moment, a strange tenderness in the gesture. She did not stir, but she carried the warmth of that touch with her for days. The winter was long, but it did not break her. Instead, it carved her into someone new, someone tougher. Her arms grew strong from hauling water, her back steady from splitting wood. She found herself humming sometimes when she worked, songs she half remembered from childhood, and once, when he came in from the snow and heard her, he paused at the door. He said nothing, only smiled faintly, but she caught the look in his eyes, like he was hearing the sound of life in his cabin for the first time. When spring finally broke, it was as if the whole mountain breathed again. Rivers rushed with meltwater, green shoots pressed through the soil, and the air smelled of pine and earth. He showed her how to plant in the small clearing near the cabin. Together they set seeds, potatoes, beans, corn. She knelt in the dirt, her hands black with soil, and felt a strange sense of pride. These were hers, planted by her own fingers, promising life in months to come. The mountain was not without danger. Wolves roamed the ridges, their howls carrying on the wind at night. Once, when she was out gathering berries in a grove, she heard the crack of branches and turned to see a bear, huge and brown, its eyes fixed on her. Fear locked her body, her breath shallow. Before she could move, a shot rang out. He stood at the edge of the grove, rifle steady. The bear reared back, growled, and lumbered away into the trees. She dropped her basket, her knees weak, but he reached her in time, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Never walk alone so far," he said, his voice sharp but not cruel. "These mountains don't forgive the careless." She nodded, her chest heaving, tears spilling now not from weakness but from the terrifying brush with death. He didn't scold further, only walked her back to the cabin, silent but protective, as if the mere space between them was something he could not bear after nearly losing her. Life settled into rhythm. Each day was filled with labor, but there was comfort in the steadiness of it. He spoke more now than he had when she first came. Sometimes he told her of his childhood, how he had grown up in the shadow of the same mountains, how his family had been poor but proud, until fever had taken them all one by one. He had stayed because the land was all he knew, but also because he felt he belonged more among the trees than in the towns below. She listened, her heart aching for the boy he had been, for the loneliness that had carved itself into him so deeply that he had learned to live without the sound of another voice. "And now?" she asked once, quietly, as they sat by the fire. He glanced at her, eyes unreadable, and for a moment she thought he would turn away. But instead he said, "Now the silence doesn't bite so hard." "Not since you came." She did not know what to answer. She only lowered her gaze, hiding the smile that threatened to rise, and stirred the stew on the fire. But inside, her heart glowed warmer than the flames. The cabin became more than shelter. It became a home. She began carving small things of her own, wooden spoons, little figures of animals she saw in the forest. She set them on the shelves, and though he never said a word about them, she noticed that he never moved them either. Once, when she carved a little bird and left it by his plate, she saw him running his thumb over it while she wasn't looking, the smallest softness breaking through his usually stern features. Their closeness grew not from grand declarations but from quiet acts. When her hands blistered from chopping too much wood, he wrapped them in salve and linen, his fingers gentle despite their roughness. When he returned from hunting late and weary, she warmed water for him and washed the blood from his hands before he ate. In those small rituals, in those wordless exchanges, something stronger than possession grew, something like trust, like love. Summer came, and with it storms that shook the mountains with thunder. One night lightning split a tree not far from the cabin, and the crash of it falling woke them both. She leapt from the bed, her heart pounding, but he pulled her close, holding her against his chest until the storm passed. She felt his heartbeat steady against her cheek, and in that moment, she realized she no longer feared the world as she once had. She had strength now, and she had him. The days grew longer, filled with the work of harvest. Together they pulled potatoes from the soil, gathered beans from their stalks, and filled the cabin with stores that would see them through another winter. She laughed once when he tried to weave baskets with her and ended up with a tangled mess of reeds. He looked at her, mock serious, then laughed too, a deep, rolling sound she had never heard from him before. It startled her, then warmed her to the bone. But life in the mountains was never without trial. One autumn evening, as he returned from setting traps, he stumbled through the door with blood soaking his leg. A boar had charged him, tusks slashing deep into his thigh before he managed to bring it down. Her hands shook as she cleaned the wound, but he gritted his teeth and bore the pain. She worked through the night, binding the gash, forcing him to drink broth, keeping watch as fever threatened. For days he drifted in and out, muttering, sweating. She prayed, though she had not prayed in years, that he would not leave her, not after she had finally found a place where she was more than nothing. When his eyes finally cleared and he whispered her name, she wept openly, pressing her face to his hand. He smiled faintly, weak but alive. Didn't know you cared that much, he teased hoarsely. She kissed his hand then, bold for the first time, and whispered, more than you'll ever know. The wound healed, leaving a scar, but also leaving them both changed. No longer were they two separate souls sharing a cabin, they were bound now, by survival, by devotion, by something unspoken but undeniable. Through the years that followed, their bond only deepened. Each season carried its hardships, but also its joys. They learned to read each other's silences, to find comfort in the simplest of things, a shared meal, a walk along the ridge, the sound of her voice humming while she worked. She grew from the discarded girl her family had sold into a woman with purpose, with strength. And he, the lonely mountain man, found himself no longer alone but with someone who turned his rugged solitude into a life worth waking to each morning. And so, as the years stretched, the cabin stood firm, not just as a shelter of logs but as a sanctuary of hearts. Two souls the world had cast aside, who had found in each other not only survival, but belonging, and love that was carved as deeply into the mountain as the rivers and trees themselves. The seasons turned again and again, the years folding into one another as time softened the edges of their hardships but never erased them. Life in the mountains was never easy, but it was life made of their own hands, their own choices. She sometimes thought back to the day her family had sold her, how they had called her useless, how they had believed she would vanish into obscurity and worthlessness. Yet here, among the towering pines and the winds that howled across the ridges, she had become someone more solid than they had ever imagined. The cabin stood not as a cage but as a monument to what she and the mountain man had built from the ashes of rejection. She had long since stopped waiting for word from her family. For the first years, she had wondered if they would come, if they would try to reclaim her, or at least if they would want to know what had become of her. But no word ever came, and she realized, with a mixture of sorrow and relief, that she had been erased from their story. That erasure, though painful, freed her too. It meant that the only story that mattered was the one she and her husband wove together. The mountain gave them both hardships and blessings. One spring she gave birth to a child, a boy with his father's gray eyes and her quiet strength. The labor had been long, the pain searing, and she had feared she might not live through it. But when she held the small, squalling life in her arms, a fierce joy spread through her heart. The man who had once lived only for survival held his son as if he were the most fragile treasure, his calloused hands trembling. "He'll never know what it means to be unwanted," he whispered that night, his forehead resting against hers as the baby slept between them. Raising a child in the mountains was no small task. The winters were cruel, the dangers of beasts and weather always near. But the boy grew strong, learning to walk on uneven earth, to climb before he could run. He followed his father into the forest, learning to track prints in the snow, to respect the silence of the trees. He followed his mother into the garden, learning to plant seeds, to coax life from the soil. She often watched the two of them together and felt her heart swell with something she could only call redemption. The girl who had been called useless had birthed a new future, and the man who had once been alone had built a family. Years passed, and more children came, 2 daughters, bright and stubborn, who chased one another through the clearing, who filled the cabin with laughter and song. Their lives were marked not by riches or grandeur but by the richness of small things. Bread fresh from the fire. The glow of lamplight on winter nights. The hush of the forest as the family sat together, their voices weaving stories into the silence. But time does not let joy remain untouched. One winter, illness swept the mountains. It began with a cough in their youngest daughter, then spread to the others. Fever burned hot, and for nights she sat awake, sponging their foreheads, praying for the strength to carry them through. Her husband took shifts beside her, his broad hand steady even when fear clouded his eyes. They fought it together, refusing to surrender, and though the sickness scarred them with exhaustion, the children survived. The cost, however, was written in the lines deepening across their faces, in the gray spreading through his beard, in the ache that never left her bones. They grew older, as all must. The boy became a man, his shoulders broad like his father's, his hands skilled in wood and steel. The daughters became women, strong-willed, unafraid, carrying both their mother's resilience and their father's quiet pride. One by one they found lives of their own, yet always they returned to the cabin, to the hearth where love had been their first inheritance. The mountain man never spoke much of love in words, but in deeds it was always there. In the way he mended her chair before she even asked. In the way he rose first to build the fire on the coldest mornings. In the way he never failed to place his hand at her back when they walked together, steadying her as the years began to slow her steps. And though she was not a woman of grand speech either, she gave him her love in her tireless care, in the meals she cooked, in the songs she hummed while he worked, in the way she always placed his tools in order because she knew he hated to lose time searching for them. Their love was not a flame that burned bright and fast, it was a fire that endured through storm, through hunger, through the long wait of years. When the children left, the cabin grew quiet again. At first, she feared the silence would be heavy, as it had been before she came. But it was different now. The silence was not emptiness, it was peace. She and he sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun sink behind the peaks. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not, but either way, they were not alone. They had built a life together, and every stone, every beam of the cabin, every row of earth in the garden was proof that their bond had endured. In the last years of his life, his strength began to fade. The man who had once carried logs on his back, who had once stood unyielding in the storm, began to walk slower, his breath shorter. She stayed at his side, just as he had stayed at hers in the early days. She cooked softer foods, tended the fire longer, pressed his hand when the pain grew heavy. He apologized once, ashamed at needing care. She silenced him with a look, her eyes fierce. You once told me I gave this cabin warmth. You gave me a life when no one else would. This is no burden, it's my gift to you. One evening, when the sky blazed red and gold, he took her hand in both of his voice weaker than she had ever heard it. They said you were useless. But you were my life. My heart. The reason these years had meaning. She pressed her forehead to his, her tears spilling freely, and whispered, and you were the man who made me see I was more than what they said. You were my beginning, my home. When he passed, it was in the cabin they had built together, with her hand still holding his. The grief was a weight like no other, pressing on her chest, threatening to break her. But even in her sorrow, she knew she had been blessed. She had been loved truly, fiercely, quietly, and she had loved the same in return. Few in the world could claim such a gift. The children returned, filling the cabin with voices again, honoring the man who had raised them, who had given them strength and steadiness. They carried him to a place high on the ridge, overlooking the valley, a place he had loved to sit and watch the seasons turn. They laid him to rest there, the mountain his eternal home, the wind his song. In the years that followed, she remained in the cabin, cared for by her children and grandchildren, yet always insisting on doing as much as she could herself. The garden still grew under her hands, the fire still burned under her watch. She told stories to the little ones, stories of the mountain, of survival, of love found where none was expected. She told them not to believe the voices that called them worthless, that every soul had purpose if only given the soil to grow. And when at last her time came, she asked only to be laid beside him, on the ridge overlooking the valley, where the cabin still stood and the mountain whispered their names. Together in life, together in death, bound not by the cruelty of the world that had once tried to discard her, but by the enduring strength of a love that had been carved out of hardship, trust, and devotion. Their story became a quiet legend in the valley below. Of the girl once sold as useless, who became the heart of a mountain home. Of the man once alone, who found not just a wife but a world reborn in her presence. Their children carried that story forward, not with grand words but with the lives they lived, lives full of dignity, resilience, and love that did not falter. And though time passed, though generations rose and fell, the cabin stood for many years, weathered but unbroken, its hearth cold but its walls still echoing with the memory of laughter, of song, of the unshakable truth that worth is never measured by coin or cruelty, but by the love two souls can build when the world turns away.